All right, everybody. Today is February the 3rd, 2021. So I'm here pleased with Nora Libertun de Duren. She's the contributing author for the first chapter of the book, Routledge, Handbook of Planning Megacities in the Global South. So again, this video is supposed to be a supplemental material for the book. That's why I invite her, and she has been graciously accepted the invitation to be here. So now I like to invite Nora to introduce yourself.
Hello, and thank you so much, Darren, for inviting me for this talk, but also especially for inviting me to contribute to this wonderful initiative on writing a book about cities in the Global South, and also having this collection of different chapters on this topic, which I think is valuable in itself. Just to give a brief presentation on myself, I'm Nora Libertun de Duren. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank as a leader in housing and urban development. And I do both projects for countries in that topic. So for example, affordable housing, national programs, but also I do research. And before that, I was the director of planning for New York City Parks Department, different kind of endeavor and in American cities. And I have a PhD from the MIT on urban development and planning, and a master in urban design from Harvard University, and a master in architecture from the University of Buenos Aires, which is where I am originally from, Buenos Aires, Argentina. And it is my pleasure to share this chapter with you all.
Right, thank you, Nora, for the introduction. That's also the reason why I invite you to writing about Buenos Aires, because you own that city, you own that mega city, because you come from there, and then you have also context about that city. So, of course, first chapter of the book titled "The Third Wave of Sprawl: The Dynamics of Peripheral Growth in Buenos Aires." So I know I like you to invite you to present that chapter. First of all, how you get that idea and why this chapter is important.
So thank you, Devin. And let me say, before going directly into the topic, a little bit about the mindset of the chapter. The chapter aims to do merge spatial thinking, an idea of how the cities are shaped and form and grow, so how they occupy the territory, with a historical thinking, which is how they change through time. And that was kind of the intellectual effort. And the lens to do that was housing production. But I think before saying more about the chapter itself or about Buenos Aires itself, I think that one of the contributions that I aimed to do was merging a narrative that goes through space with the idea of the footprint and how that evolves. And I think that is where the stories of cities are more interesting to be seen, and also can let us know more about how they would be changing in the future, because it's the idea of the two dimensions, the space and the time. You want me to go deeper into the book?
Yes, okay. Yes, please, to that chapter.
Okay, so basically what I do in that chapter is I provide a summary of the city, more like a photo in time, where we are. And also I try to explain the different forces from the perspective of housing that gave shape to the urban form of the city as we see it now. And that's why I call the three waves of sprawl. So they are, in the timeline, I'm talking about three moments that move the boundaries of the city, like the footprint of the city. Just to give a brief summary of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires, as you all know, is the capital of Argentina. And one thing that is important to understand is that even Argentina is a territorial, it's a very big country. Buenos Aires accounts for about 40% of the population and more than a third of its GDP. So the weight that the city has on the country in all dimensions, it's really biasing many things that happen in the territory. Mm. And that implies that the distribution of the population in Buenos Aires has many implications to the whole national development. Mm. Just to give a perspective on this, as I said, Buenos Aires is 40% of the population of Argentina. New York City is less than 6% of the US. And why that is important, besides many, many implications, is that the freedom of people to choose where to live in the country is limited, in the sense that their ability to find the level of economic opportunities and the level of services that Buenos Aires offers is very, very limited. They have their 2-3 more cities, but they are really in a different tier, and that creates problems in terms of the mobility of households in choosing where to live. So that's why these waves that I'm going to describe are so meaningful, because really there are limited choices for people to move around. So the story focuses on the last 80 years, 100 years of the city. And basically the first wave is when people from other parts of the country were moving into the city, or migrants were foreigners were moving into the city in search of jobs. And that's kind of the typical Latin American story, in which we see surrounding the city a ring of poor households, which in many places are called shanty towns or favelas or slums, which are the newcomers. Mm-hmm. Which the expectation was that they were going to be a one generation or maybe a few years, and they will be moving into the city itself, like gain in terms of their ability to hold a formal job that will allow them to have a place in the city. It did not happen in many places. In Buenos Aires, it did not happen as such, but the city kept on growing. So many of those places, instead of being in the boundary of the city, become merged with the city. And that has implications in terms of the future growth, because areas that were undervalued because of their location becomes valuable after the population start needing those spaces. So that would be the first wave. The second wave has the opposite direction, and it is coming from the downtown, let's say, from the city core to the periphery. And in this case, it's not the poor people who want to live and to participate in the job market of the city who moves to the city, but it's mostly middle and high income households who move to the periphery. That's similar to other countries as well. We have seen that, in North America, but also in many other countries in Mexico and in Brazil, where affluent households can choose and opt to leave the city for private services. That's gated communities. And that will be the second wave of sprawl. And the third one, which is interesting, it's when the state start building housing complexes for low-income households, and they move them to the outskirts of the city. So it's even farther. And that has been a very, rapid description of this. But the thing to keep in mind is who is doing what and where. So in the first one, it's self-built, self-decided households who moved to the city, from the periphery to the inside of the city. In the second one, it's the private production of the city. The first one was an informal production. In the second one is private production of the city that happens began in the 1980s, and in a way it still continues. It was households choosing to move to the periphery, affluent households, and housing built by the private sector. And in the third one, we see poor households being moved to the periphery by the state. So that's a different thing. And the reason why this matters is because we have geography. And every time you move, you add a cost to commuting, a cost to the household, a cost in terms of opportunities. And this is particularly troublesome for the lowest income households who are not having the resources to commute easily. When someone moves to a gated community, is likely to do so with a private car. We have been seeing that the commuting from the periphery to the area where you can find a job might take like 3 hours or more of daily commute. So the implications are very serious of all these movements. And of course, it has implications in terms of not only the development of the household itself, in terms of the environment, in terms of the use of resources, but also, interestingly enough, it has implications in terms of the creation of communities. Because when you have very poor people living next to affluent people, the way that it has been solved was by gating. And that has also implication in terms of how you create a society. I think I'll stop here, and perhaps you would like to ask more questions or go deeper.
Yes, good. So in the beginning, you said Buenos Aires, 40% of Argentine population. That's a lot. So because of that, it triggered my questions, right? So is it because geographically other part of Argentina is not really placed for living, or because of the attraction for job is so high concentrated in Buenos Aires?
That's an excellent question. And it's not the geography which gives us the answer as such. It's not that the rest of the country is has no water, or like it's subject to some kind of like environmental disaster. Not at all. At the contrary, Mendoza, Cordoba, Rosario, they're all beautiful cities, and even there are smaller cities, north and south, that are very, very beautiful. It has to do with the development history of the country, in which the city of Buenos Aires was concentrating the political power and the economic resources, which in our case, in terms of geography, those translated into infrastructure and investment, and also implied that the majority of the job opportunities are there. And I think it's interesting, just going back to history, that as you know, Argentina was part of the Spanish colonization of Latin America. And at that moment, the center of the region was not the most important port was close to Peru. So the most important cities were very close to that part, and the internal trade was valuable. Later, the most important trade was with Europe through Buenos Aires, and that began to increase more and more, especially after the train tracks were installed, and Buenos Aires was the main port for all merchandise, and that kind of shift the population, the balance of the population, to the city of Buenos Aires. And when Argentina had its great European migration in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, most people located in Buenos Aires. And that also shifted the whole balance of population. What I want to say is that the imbalance of the population is more recent than the country. Like the country was more, Buenos Aires was always a capital, but now the distribution of population and resources is even more imbalanced than 100 years ago. And it has to do with the infrastructure, and it has to do with the distribution of opportunities, and it's kind of a, you know, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know.
Interesting, because when you learn that there is urban primacy in Buenos Aires in the past, and then it's not addressed that primacy, but even worse now. So why this happened?
It's it has to do with the history of the country, and I think it exceeds the chapter. It's more like a national issue, but has to do with political tensions between the capital city and the rest of the provinces. It's part of the DNA of the way that the country gained its independence, you know, has to do with that friction. And there was a whole school of thinking in the 1960s, 1970s in Latin America about development, like development. Yes. And the aim of that school of thinking, at least, you know, for Argentina, was to promote the production of the industrialization of the country, and also the decentralization of the country. And there was some investment in that direction at that moment, but it was not enough. It was not sustained through time. And now we see that the imbalance is still there. And also the whole issue of a high degree of informality makes it harder, you know, and also it has to do with the weight, because when we talk about Buenos Aires, it's important to distinguish that we have two different institutions, like in terms of ruling the territory. One is the city of Buenos Aires, and the other one is the province of Buenos Aires. The city is autonomous. The province is, let's say, it's everything that surrounds it. And they respond to different, usually to different political parties, not always, but usually. And Buenos Aires, the metropolitan Buenos Aires is the 40%. The city of Buenos Aires, it's way less than that. It has a stable population, you know, for the last 20 years, it has been, you know, like less than 3 million. But that division that I just described also make it harder to create policies for decentralization. You know, so
I see. So, because, you know, when I reviewed not just Argentine, but also other countries in Latin America, that part of the world, they already urbanized in 1960s or 1980s. It's not like Asian or even Africa. They still very unurbanized at that time. So when you have that early urbanizations, but then what factor that make urbanizations in Latin America or in Buenos Aires not really bring the country to the next level? Because I know there is a trap for middle class country. So if Argentina already in the middle class country back in 1980s, right, or earlier than that, and then urbanization is play a role too in terms of growth of the country. So how you relate that urbanization, early urbanization, compared with other parts of the world, and then how Argentina moved or did not move to the next level of that category of the country?
This is a very important question, and I will provide some insights. I wish I had the right and the definite answer. I mean, it's something that we keep on thinking all the time, why that has happened.
Yes.
Moreover, the country, the GDP is lower now than it was 100 years ago. So it's like undeveloping countries. So there are questions about that.
Yeah.
But, I think there are a number of things. One, and I always insist on this, we should define urbanization, because the urbanization is something that we take from censuses. The notion of how we have two things: urban people, not urban people. And the threshold is a factor that is constructed, and basically it means anything, anywhere. For example, it could be minimum number of people in certain location, which could range from 2,000 people to 100,000 people. It could mean that it's the capital of a province. That doesn't mean it's urban. It's the capital of the province. It's just the title it has. In some countries, it's defined by density. So when we say urban, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to see a city. Basically, it's everything that is not rural, which is not the same as being a city. So that's one thing. Having said that, Buenos Aires is truly a city. There's no question about it. I'm just highlighting this when we read all these, reports on like the whole the world is urbanized, or we should really think hard about what are we saying when we say that, because this is just adding the numbers that come from national censuses, and they all have different definitions. But that's one thing. Buenos Aires is a city. So the question is like, why it has not developed the country as much? A number of things. One is that, yes, it has been a force for development. It has not been enough. But if you compare, the number of the level of education, the number of new enterprises, the GDP per capita of the main three cities of the country, or Buenos Aires in this case, to the rest of the country, is way higher. So they are a force for development. It's not that they are against the theory. Having said that, they have shortcomings that are undermining that development. Some of those shortcomings are in the city, and some of those shortcomings are in the nation. I mean, a city cannot change the trajectory of a nation by itself. So which are the shortcomings at the level of the nation? It has to do with the institutions, and it has to do with the infrastructure that, I mean, it's way complex, but the whole idea that you don't have a network of cities is undermining the development of all the country. And it has to do with other services like access to education and access to health and access to institutions. But that's at the national level. The shortcomings of the city, it has to do with the level of informality that it's there. It's really a hurdle for allowing cities to provide the most they can provide. And one thing that we see, that's focusing in the cities itself, in the case of Buenos Aires, but also of many Latin American cities, is an immense contrast in the quality of services people receive in the same city. So there are parts of the city that have access to everything you would expect, and the quality is really high. The quality of access to technology, digital technology, but also education and health and safety and the environment could be, so everything, it's really at a very high level. And also you measure that, and the human development index of those parts also, it's very high. But in the same city, you have a high percentage of people who are not having access to the basic things. For example, in Buenos Aires, in metropolitan Buenos Aires, I think that there might be a third of the people who do not have access to basic sewage. And that's the kind of thing that is becoming a hurdle. And then the same with transportation services, the same with education. And, many services are provided, and that's also complexity. Some services are provided by local municipalities, some are provided by states, some are provided by national levels. And the quality of the service and the access to services is very different. And that does not allow for taking advantage of that density or that agglomeration, and you don't get economies of scale. And what, at the end of the day, economies of scale depends on technology and on institutions. Otherwise it's just congestion, like you just have too many people together. That if you don't have good institutions and if you don't have technology, that doesn't mean that you're going to profit so much from that. And what we see is that unevenness that does not allow taking advantage of the engine of development that cities could be. And I think that one of the most clear markers of that unevenness is the level of informality in housing that we see in the city, in which there are like more than 100 shanty towns or slums or informal neighborhoods. They have different names. And that's kind of showing you that you have a large amount of population which are not having access to good services, to good institutions, and of course they cannot be contributing to the society at their full capacity.
I learned something what we just said. You are telling us, when you have urbanizations, people was thinking urbanizations will bring prosperity, will bring growth. It will not deliver that growth, it will not deliver that prosperity, it will not push that country to the next level if there is still inequality. There is still people who don't have access to basic needs. That's what you learn, what happened with Buenos Aires.
I think what you see is that there is always a hurdle. I mean, you're not going to get the most of it. And just let me provide an example. If you have, well, the most clear example is COVID now, for example. Is that you would not get the city together if you have one part of the population who does not have access to basic services for health. You wouldn't be able to, have a healthy society or a productive society. Of course, there will be some production, there will be something, and it would be better than not having anything. But I mean, you will always be producing more than a rural society. That's kind of, that's there. And the promise of the city is also seeing in the fact that people keep on going to the city, which means that the conditions in rural areas are not appealing. So there is a promise there, and it's truly something that could happen. But unless you have a way to integrate everybody in the city, you will not be profiting as you could from that density.
Very good point. I know we can talk about this forever, but I need to move to the next point of your paper. Okay. So in your paper, you also mentions about spatial path development framework. Okay. Why you use this and why it's important?
Thank you for asking me that. So basically, I was trying to territorialize the idea of Douglas North in terms of the role of institutions, like how incentives and condition the way that the society can develop, because they have a continuity in time. They provide a continuity in time that affects what's going to happen next. It's not just a change in leadership that will change how things will evolve. You know, there are certain institutions, and even changing those institutions demand energy. So that's going to be there one way or the other. So what I was trying to do is, with that idea, make a case for the space and the notion that the geography plays a role. For example, in the case of Buenos Aires, the fact that the periphery of the city was really undeveloped and was, in terms of infrastructure, and was populated by many informal neighborhoods and shanty towns, it kind of conditioned that the next sprawl was going to be gated. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been gated. One of the reasons why it was gated is that because your neighbors were so poor, affluent people would not like to be in the same area, and also they had to provide private services. So the pre-existence of the way that the territory was developed was creating the conditions of the next development. That doesn't mean that it cannot change, but that change has to materialize and to affect the space in a certain way. So that's what I wanted to talk about, the spatial path development. In a way, you know, to reframe what Douglas North has given us as a lens to understand history.
So if you apply that framework in Buenos Aires, do you think this framework also applicable to other parts of the world or even here in the global north?
I'm sure it's something that, you know, if you try to map the development of a city through time, or even the development of a territory, you know, even on another scale through time, I'm sure that you would see the footprints of institutions, but you will also see that changing that footprint has implications, and those has to be taken into account. You know, that's what I said at the very beginning. We tend to have, you know, because we explain our thought with words, we see this kind of like chronological thing. But when we explain our thought with maps, we see something different. And I think that applies to all, you know, cities in the world.
Very good. Okay, so now I come back to your third wave, right? As you know, we have suburbanization. So when we expanding our territory, our area of urban, right? And then of course that's become your second wave when all this middle class, upper class move to suburban areas. That's suburbanizations. But no, there's also people called post-suburban area, or post-suburban era, meaning that all these suburbs areas, they become their own area, independent, not really dependent on that core. So in reference to that post-suburban era, and then what you call third wave. So how you link this between third wave and post-suburban era?
I think that it's a very important question and something that we have to rethink in light of COVID. That there's a whole question there about the autonomy of the household and the workers from their employees, so that will create that. I think that thinking about the future, to which extent those areas can be autonomous. I mean, we will never be autonomous of space. You know, you will be needing a surrounding. But I think that what we will see is that the contrast between those who can choose where to live and those who can not choose where to live is going to be more visible. But I have to say, it's not just because of your income level. It has to do also with your occupations. You know, some people might have like high income and high education and still have to go to their job every day. You know, like you're a surgeon. And at the contrary, there might be people who are in a different economy and they can do something very local, like, you know, like local delivery or local bakery. So the lines that are going to divide who is going to be commuting or not commuting, I think are going to define how those and how autonomous are those peripheral cells, let's say, of development. And also the other thing that we need to talk more about is the ownership of land. You know, in some places that could happen, and in some places that could not easily happen, because many places, and it depends on who owns the land and what is the regulation in terms of density for that land. So could you sustain, you know, something which it's zoned just for single story, you know, single home housing, and create something like that? And so I think that many things has to be rethought and analyzed in terms of which is going to be the form of the city, and both from the perspective of the households as well as from the perspective of the city itself. You know, which kind of services and which kind of planning tools we need.
Based on the trend or the pattern that has happened in Buenos Aires, and you know, first wave, second wave, third wave, and then of course also you learn from other megacities in Latin America. So what is what you see in the next future, in the next future about the development or growth of Buenos Aires? Do you think this third wave will sustain like this, or do you think will another wave that we call fourth wave, or what?
Yeah, I think that it will depend on the quality of the services municipalities can offer, and also on the ability, on the technology, on how much technology can sustain, you know, this situation where people are far away from their jobs. And what we are seeing now is a test. Do people like it? You know, because that's the other thing. Do people like being outside of the city? Is that something that is preferable? It has to do, and there are many studies that show that there is also a life cycle. It might be something that certain people like at certain moment in their life, but other people don't prefer that. Like, so the demographics are going to play a role here. We see typically, at least in the US and even in Argentina too, families with children might prefer the suburbs, family without children might not.
Yes.
So the percentage of old people is growing. The percentage of household with kids is it's lower now. That's something to say. Another thing to say is when we study households according to who is the head of the household, if it's a man or a woman, that also affect their locational choices. Women prefer, when the head is a single woman, regardless of their income, you know, they prefer to be in the city because they do value being close to everything, because they are responsible for the kids and you know, their extended family, so they want to be close to the extended family. And so that's one model, and that's the type of household that is becoming more common. So I don't know, you know, it has to do with, there are many things that are moving at the same time.
I see.
Demographic, technology, how people are going to value services, including environment.
Yes.
So let's see. Let's talk next year.
I know we're talking about uncertainties here when we're dealing with the future, of course. But if you have the authority as a planner, and then you have power to execute that plan, what will you do with Buenos Aires?
Okay, I think that number one, there is a basic of services that everybody has to have access to. It could not be the case that some people do not have access to safe water, to sanitation, to electricity. That's a basic. That's kind of a no-brainer. Everybody should have access to that.
Okay.
That's the number one. And then there are other services like education and health that often depend on the municipal level, that also has to be good for everybody. That's kind of even the field. That's number one. And then the other thing is to ease the transaction, the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And informality in housing is very much related to informality in labor. And we have to see ways to make this transition easier. It's often the case that, for example, someone who's living in an informal neighborhood might be paying prices as high as someone who's living in the formal market.
Yes.
So those boundaries have to, we have to study how to make them disappear. We have to think that housing is a service. It's a bundle of services. It's a platform for having access to a bundle of services more than a good in itself. So we have to try to make the rental market more flexible, so it's more
affordable.
And it makes it easier, for people to move from informality to formality. And I think that just by doing that, many things are going to be like more prosperous, and also to lower the cost of doing business in the city. That's critical.
So if you are advocating other megacities, other emerging urban areas around the world, especially in the global south, based on lesson learned from Buenos Aires, is even the mistakes or the good lesson, what will you tell them? How? Yes.
Okay, so I think that what I just said, I guess it's important for every city, like basic services for everywhere. That should be important. To have a way to make the housing market accessible, the formal housing market accessible to all residents. Informality doesn't go by itself. That was kind of a myth that we have, that the shanty towns were part, that if you read the literature in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was that shanty towns were part of an evolution, and that eventually people will move from shanty towns to formal housing. It does not happen, and it's likely that the prices of housing in cities will go up. They will not go down. I mean, average, going through time, space is going to be scarce. So act sooner rather than later on that one. And do invest a lot in institutions. And that's one thing. And the other thing, make cities work for everybody. Cities should work for women, cities should work for people with disabilities, cities should work for migrants, for children. That's something to think when you invest in infrastructure. It has to be inclusive.
Thank you. It's almost an hour. So okay. the last one. What is your concluding remark based on your chapters in the book, and also based on our conversations?
So my concluding remark is that cities are part of humanity. So let's think how to make them better. There has not been civilization without density. So let's use our powers, our technology, and our ability to talk with each other to make them better. And I think that one of the most important things that technology has allowed us to do is to be being more inclusive, allowing more people to participate in society and understanding that there are many, many ways to participate. And I think we have to take advantage of that opportunity to build cities that work for all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.